Hello, hello, hello everyone, I am PrincessAmiAudios. If you're not out tonight celebrating Halloween by getting all dolled up in your best costume, scary or otherwise, gathering candy or playing hide and seek in abandoned houses or graveyards, then I humbly thank you for joining me tonight. Now, I have a few friends of mine joining me this fine evening. We'll be reading off some of our favorite horror-themed stories to keep you up tonight. My guests include my dearest big brother CardlinAudio, my self-proclaimed mother figure SunflowerAudio, Derailed Audios, Crimson King Broonstud, and Jiggy Wiggy ASMR. Our stories may range from a silly little legend to something a little deeper. With that being said, how about we turn down the lights, curl up in a blanket with whatever snacks you have on hand, and make sure that shadow in the corner doesn't move any closer. For our first story of the night, let's begin on a light note, though I can't guarantee it won't make your skin crawl. Without further ado, CardlinAudios will be narrating The Red Spot.
One night, a young girl was sleeping in her bed when a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for a few minutes on her left cheek, then it went on its way. When she woke up the next morning and looked in the mirror, she noticed a red spot on her cheek.
"What's this?"
she asked her mother.
"It looks like a spider bite,"
her mother replied.
"It will go away, just don't scratch it."
Soon, the small red spot grew into a big, red boil.
"Look at it now,"
the girl said.
"It's getting bigger." "That sometimes happens,"
her mother said.
"It's coming to a head."
In a few days, the red spot was even larger.
"Look at it now,"
the girl said.
"It hurts so much and it makes me look so ugly." "We'll have the doctor look at it,"
her mother said.
"Maybe it's infected."
But the doctor couldn't see the girl until the next day. That night, she decided to take a nice, relaxing bath. As she lay, soaking in the warm water, the boil suddenly burst. Out poured a swarm of tiny spiders from the eggs their mother had laid in her cheek.
What a nightmare. Hopefully you won't have a hard time figuring out which cobwebs are fake and which are real tonight. Wouldn't want an infestation now, would we? Next up, SunflowerAudio, accompanied by both Derailed and Cardlin, will be telling a tale of a quaint little business called Miss Marnie's Tea House.
"You're going to hell, child of Satan, you'll burn in agony just like the Jews and towelheads. God will cast thee down, down into Gehenna. Burn, witch."
That's how I used to begin my morning. Every morning. I lived in the same little tea house that my mama lived in, and her mama before her. And for as long as I can remember, we've lived next to Mrs. Thompson, who was perhaps the nastiest lady I have ever had the privilege of meeting. Her voice has assaulted my ears since childhood. Either she was yelling at my mama or antagonizing me while I played outside. I don't know how she came to the conclusion that we're witches, but no matter how kind we were to her, her words were always the same. Die. Burn in hell. Satan spawn. Witches. Bitches. So, every morning I'd walk to my car amidst her screeching and try to tune it out as I prepared for the day. After all, it's no good coming into work at a tea house when you're stressed. Your foul mood will poison the tea, or at least that's what my mama always told me. Just like our home, the tea house has been in my family for generations. It's always owned and managed by a woman, and we never take employees that aren't needed. Besides, it's hard to teach a newcomer the finer points of tea making. Me? I've been studying tea since I was a child, as my mama passed down her secrets to me. It's a wonderful job, a wonderful life, and I quite enjoy it. All except for Mrs. Thompson, of course. Every morning at the tea house was the same. I began by rinsing out the cast iron teapot and teacups. You can't use soap on them, you know, and you can't wash the outside. You can only rinse them, and over time they'll take on the flavor of the teas you brew in them. Which is why I have a separate tea set for each kind of tea. Green, black, yellow, oolong, white, and herbal infusions. I'd set the metal teapots to brew hot water on the stove. You can't put cast iron on the stove either. And while prepping the water, I'd select the teas I would feature that day. Of course, a customer can come in and request any kind of tea they like, but I always like to give my own personal recommendations. I would open the store at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd spend my day serving tea. I had quite a few regular customers that enjoyed the healing properties of tea. People with stomach problems who like the jade mint oolong, people with anxiety prefer the chamomile blossom, or people who simply enjoyed the traditional taste and brewing process of matcha. Well, one morning, someone new came into the tea house. Someone I never expected to see. Jamie Thompson. Mrs. Thompson's grandson, who spent most of his time caring for the aging crony, was standing at the front of my tea house, watching me serve mango black tea to a few elderly tourists looking for something sweet and strong.
Miss Marnie, I see your tea house is doing well.
He began. I noticed elderly women staring at him in open appreciation. He was quite handsome, even I must admit, but I ignored him and went back to the tea preparation. Tea takes all of your attention, all of your heart. If you don't give it everything you got, it'll fail you because you have already failed yourself. Once the tea was prepared and the women were enjoying it ice, I stood up and approached the conspicuous newcomer. Mr. Thompson, I take it. What can I do for you today? Most of the time, I'd start by asking what a customer likes, what a customer needs, what ailments are troubling them. I like to help people, but I was wary of Jamie. Nothing good comes from a poison plant, after all.
Well, I'm actually here to get something from my grandmother. See, her mind is going. I read that tea is good for dementia, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations?
It's true, studies have shown that certain kinds of tea are good at preserving brain mass, but as of yet, nothing in modern medicine is miraculous enough to reverse dementia. Still, nature works in funny ways. I went behind the front counter to examine my selection of green teas.
You know, my grandmother, she probably wouldn't drink this if she knew you had prepared it.
I grunted in assent, none too keen on continuing our conversation. Jamie didn't seem to notice my reticence, or perhaps he didn't care.
But, you know, I'm hoping that maybe this will help patch things up between you. I think she'd really like you if she got to know you. I've always found you fascinating.
I selected some Gyokuro Imperial and turned to face him, praising his expression. The light in his eyes told me he was using his grandmother as a pretense to come see Me. Oh. Oh! Ignoring his obvious interest, I prepared the tea leaves and rang up his purchase, explaining how they were best brewed and when to drink it for the best results. To his credit, he was very attentive, although he seemed more interested in my lips than the words coming out of them.
Well, thank you for this. I'll give it to my grandmother and come back to tell you the results.
You needn't bother, I retorted, anxious to get him out of my store. But he smiled and returned, not a bit perturbed by my attitude.
Oh, you can't get rid of me that easily, Miss Marnie. I'll be back.
With that, he turned and strode out of the store, the door still gawking at his tall, muscular frame. That was the start of all the trouble. Since that day, Jamie started coming in regularly, always asking for my recommendations, always claiming that my tea helped his grandmother heal. I sincerely doubted that, but I didn't bother correcting his ignorance. After all, it was just a facade. At the close of each purchase, he would ask me the same exact question.
So, do you have any plans for the night?
Most of the time, I declined to answer. I had to admit he was patient and persistent. He never missed a day. He was sweet in his own way. He handed out compliments like candy, but only ever to me. Sometimes he brought in flowers, although I couldn't keep them in the store. The scent would taint the tea. He brought me sweets on occasion. It was really starting to get on my nerves. Finally, one day, he didn't immediately ask me out. Instead, he presented me with an opportunity, one that was too good to pass up.
Honestly, Marnie, I'll do anything you want to just have one date. What do I have to do?
You can't afford a date with me, I assured, although the wheels in my head were already turning.
Money isn't an object. Living next to my grandma all these years, you have to know my family is loaded.
He flashed me his patented, arrogant grin that somehow managed to hold a certain magnetic charm.
Name it and I'll do it. I'll make you understand how serious I am.
He seemed serious, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, he could be the one I've been searching for. And if he was, oh, I'd never dare dream. I grabbed out a post-it note and began scribbling the details on it as I told him what I wanted more than anything in the world. There's a tea grown in the Fujian province of China called Dagon Pao, or Big Red Rope. It grows so high in the mountains that only a few select tea masters are able to pick it. However, what many people don't know is that there are two strains of Dagon Pao, the kind that is sold to the public and a rare kind that is used in medicine and religious rituals. I glanced into his eyes, but they remained impassive. I dared to finish. I want you to get it for me. He smirked, as though amused by my reticence.
No problem. Is it expensive?
I paused to consider that question. The tea itself, no. If you tell them you need it, if you tell them I need it, they'll give it to you. Only you have to fly to China and get it yourself. They won't send it to you. You won't be able to find a trace of them outside their own little province. They're cut off from the world, and that's what makes their tea so special. Jamie paused as if to consider this, making a very serious face and stroking his chin. Finally, he winked at me.
Consider it done.
My heart skipped a beat. All this time, searching for the right person, he'd been right next to me, waiting for me to notice him. Life seemed to move at a glacial pace after that. Jamie bought the tickets and set the date for 6 months after I gave him my request. During that half year, he studied Mandarin with a passion I had never seen in anyone else before. He even managed to track down a Fujianese native and began studying the dialect. He took very careful instruction from me as to how he could find the master tea pickers. The day before he left, he came to see me, glowing with confidence as though he had already succeeded in his quest. I knew that the worst was yet to come for him, but he didn't seem concerned. Before he walked out of my store, he stood in front of me and requested, no, demanded a kiss for good luck. I was so excited and flustered I leaned forward and picked him on the lips without stopping to think. He laughed at the blush suffusing my skin and walked out, anticipating grand adventure. Weeks passed, several of them in fact, and yet not a word from Jamie. I tried to remind myself to be patient. After all, he had to arrive in China, hike to the mountains, and navigate his way to the secret property of the master pickers. Reaching them would take time, and that's not to mention gaining their trust. I could only hope that they'd be a little bit more compliant when he mentioned my name. Then, a few more weeks. I noticed that Mrs. Thompson was too preoccupied to harass me. She seemed shaken by Jamie's absence. Not that surprised me. He was, after all, her primary caretaker, and though she could still manage on her own at this point, she liked the company. I was beginning to think that I would never hear back from Jamie when one morning I arrived at the tea house to find a man sitting in front of the shop. He was an elderly Chinese man wearing traditional garb. In his arm, he held a black lacquered chest. My heart stopped. When he saw me approach, he knelt in front of me and kowtowed 3 times. I inclined my head as a gesture of appreciation, and then I opened the tea house and let him inside. We didn't exchange any words, although I am fluent in both Mandarin and Fujianese. Instead, I brewed him a cup of golden monkey black tea, which he drank for ritual's sake. Once he finished his tea, he walked out the door and out of my life, but he left behind the chest. My hand shook as I lifted it, feeling its severe heft, and carried it to the back room. Locking the door and closing the blinds, I opened the chest. The first things I saw were the bones. Each and every bone in Jamie's body sat in the chest, nearly packed into a solid mass. I took them out one at a time, spreading them over my work table, admiring their pristine white color. I had never seen anything so beautiful. Beneath the bones, separated by a wooden slot, was the tea. In small, dark green leaves with distinct golden flecks. That was how I knew they'd given me the right product. The flashes of gold were the ticket. Yes, Jamie was the one I'd been waiting for, the one I needed, the bargaining chip that got me my most precious treasure. He was a perfect sacrifice. Mrs. Thompson changed after Jamie was officially declared missing. It was assumed he had died hiking in China. An inexperienced hiker can easily go missing without the proper guide, and just like that, she found herself alone in the world. Her other children and grandchildren would have nothing to do with her. She stopped screaming at me in the mornings. She stopped coming outside at all. I couldn't just leave her alone like that. One morning, I brought a special tea brew over just for her. When I knocked on the door, I half expected her to cuss me out, shouting obscenities and misquoted Bible verses. Instead, she led me into her kitchen, and I brewed her tea. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. After a few minutes, she spoke on her own about how Jamie had been so taken with me, sung my praises until she herself had begun to come around. About how much she had always loved him, how her whole life had revolved around him ever since he had been born. She began crying at one point. In fact, she kept crying until I set her tea in front of her. Almost absent-mindedly, she sipped the brew and gave me a surprised look.
This is good.
I smiled at her. It is, isn't it? It only took a few days to get Mrs. Thompson to agree that I should be your new primary caretaker. Of course, she didn't need much care anymore. Not after she began drinking my tea. After a few weeks, her forgetfulness, the signs of her dementia, they began to fade. She was as sharp as she'd always been. Of course, that was intentional. I do, after all, want her to live a nice, long life, full of memories of Jamie, and the agony of never knowing what happened to him. It's amazing what a little tea and bone marrow can do to a person. As for me, well, I got what I wanted. I got the rare formula I need to give my tea healing powers. I got the sacrifice for those brews that require something darker. And without Mrs. Thompson ranting and screaming, my mornings became much more peaceful. Which, honey, that doesn't even begin to cover what I'm capable of.
Oh, how romantic. Such dedication. It makes you feel all warm inside, doesn't it? In our next story, let us revisit an old classic. You can never go too wrong with Poe, now can you? Let us take a trip inside Derailed's strange little mind as she reads to us The Telltale Heart.
True, nervous. Very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I'm mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It's impossible to say how the idea first entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me, day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He'd never wronged me. He'd never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was his eye. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad, but madmen know nothing. You should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of the door and opened it, oh so gently. And then, when I'd made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. You would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well into the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. So cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by his name in a hearty tone, inquiring how he'd passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers.
I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened, through fear of Roberts, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door. And I kept pushing it on, steadily, steadily. I had my head in, was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still, and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I had done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or grief, no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo. The terrors distracted me. I say I knew it well. Deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he'd been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he'd turned in the bed. His fears had only ever since been growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He'd been saying to himself, "It's nothing but the wind in the chimney. It's only a mouse crossing the floor. Or it's merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he'd been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with its thick black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern, so I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open. Wide, wide open. I grew furious as I gazed upon it, for I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones, but I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say louder, every moment. Do you mark me well? I've told you that I'm nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbour. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern, leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It wouldn't be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. his eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I'd been far too wary for that. A tub had caught them all. When I made an end of these labours, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them, at length, to his chamber. I showed them his treasure, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I, myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things, but ere long I felt myself getting pale, and wished them were gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat, and still they chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued, and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued, and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all, and they continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? No, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now again, louder, louder, louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, it is the beating of his hideous heart.
God, I do love the classics, don't you? Speaking of which, I believe my dearest friend Crimson has something important he'd like to share with you. Of course, there's no use in angering the elder gods, now is there? But let's hear him out for a moment. In Dagon.
I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I'm a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due to us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastnesses of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be a wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid, with the carcasses of decaying fish, and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime, yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled in the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking, or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I had attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon that had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian depths where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I have ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine, which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestors of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it, with only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface. The thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent off the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship, which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I seem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist, and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless save. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow man. Often I asked myself if it could not have all been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window!
Oh dear. Seems like I won't be hearing back from him anytime soon. Oh well. We shall see. Next up, Jiggy has an interesting file which I'm sure all of you would absolutely love to know about. Of course, let's try and keep SCP-1981 just between us, shall we?
SCP Foundation Informational Files and Recordings. Item number SCP-1981. This object is classified as safe. Special containment procedures are as follows. SCP-1981 is to be kept inside a secure video storage unit at the Media Archive of Site. When in use, SCP-1981 should not be removed from its casing or exposed to any strong magnetic sources. A Betamax home video system and an analog television have been provided in Observation Theater 2 at Site, as well as video equipment to record viewings. Included with this recording is a file that contains photographs, labeled A through G. These photographs are stills from the tape retrieved from previous viewings of SCP-1981. They will be used as visual aid throughout the recording as they are referenced. The description of SCP-1981 is as follows. SCP-1981 is a standard Betamax tape. Ronald Reagan cut up while talking has been handwritten on the adhesive sticker in felt-tip pen, all in capital letters. Laboratory analysis indicates that SCP-1981 is made of ordinary material, and serial numbers correspond with the home cassette tapes produced in September of 1980. SCP-1981 was initially encountered by a filing clerk in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library of 1991, who, upon watching it, alerted the police with the intent to find the tape's creator to press obscenity charges. A low-level police investigation was conducted, at which point the Foundation was alerted and secured SCP-1981. Class A amnesiacs were administered before could be notified. Further investigation of the library's records by Foundation personnel failed to yield any leads on SCP-1981's origin. SCP-1981 appears to be a home video recording of former United States President Ronald Reagan delivering his Evil Empire speech to the National Association of Evangelicals at Sheraton Twin Towers Hotel, Orlando, Florida, on the 8th of March, 1983. However, at 1 minute and 10 seconds, the speech begins to deviate heavily, eventually resembling no known speech ever made by Reagan. Beginning at approximately 5 minutes, multiple incisions, laceration, and penetration wounds can be seen being slowly inflicted, though no corresponding source of these wounds is visible. Refer to photographs C through E. Despite suffering bodily harm that would likely incapacitate an ordinary person, Reagan will continue to deliver his speech until either his vocal cords are severed or the tape degrades to static at 22 minutes and 34 seconds. Upon rewinding SCP-1981 and initiating playback, Reagan will deliver an entirely new speech, often radically different from the ones previously observed. Topics have included torture, child molestation, and ritual sacrifice. Trauma inflicted upon Reagan also appears to be divergent, with impalement, genital mutilation, and having all been observed. In roughly 1 in 7 viewings of SCP-1981, a figure clothed in black robes with a conical hood will have replaced a random member of Reagan's press detail, henceforth referred to as SCP-1981-1. Refer to photograph B, noting the presence of SCP-1981-1 on the left side of the photo. The significance of the appearance of SCP-1981-1 is currently unknown. The speeches delivered by Reagan are mostly incoherent, lacking any sort of underlying thematic structure, and largely being composed of nonsensical anecdotes and parables. However, occasionally references are made to future events that Reagan could not possibly have known about or predicted, such as the September 11th terrorist attacks, the result of the 2008 Russian elections, and for this reason, rigorous time and effort has been devoted to recording the speech delivered on each playback. Attempts to replicate SCP-1981 onto a similar Betamax tape have met with failure. However, cameras used to record the television SCP-1981 is broadcasted on have succeeded in quote-unquote capturing individual playbacks, the stills of which you see in the photographs before you. Any observations performed on SCP-1981 must be recorded on the camcorder provided and delivered for subsequent review to Dr. Project Supervisor. Years of natural magnetic interference has severely degraded SCP-1981's signal quality, making it even more difficult to sift meaningful information from playbacks. Additionally, the gruesome nature of the mutilations performed upon Reagan have been described as extremely disturbing. And for this reason, it is recommended that any personnel feeling squeamish or ill after playback visit the on-site psychiatry facility for Level 3 evaluation. As Ronald Reagan was alive at the time of SCP-1981's containment, a surveillance net was deployed to establish any relation between him and SCP-1981. No known connection was developed, though Reagan would frequently complain about nightmares before his mental state degenerated due to Alzheimer's. Several notable transcripts have been recorded during viewings of SCP-1981, as early as 1993. The last notable transcript was recorded on 2005. The transcript from 2005 is described as follows. Upon playback, immediately shown is a long shot of the podium as well as empty chairs normally occupied by Reagan and his entourage. Curiously, this is the only recording that lacks both the intertitles and the presence of Ronald Reagan. 30 seconds later, the camera zooms in on the podium. 2 minutes and 25 seconds later, the entity known as SCP-1981-1 enters the shot from the left and stands at the podium. SCP-1981-1 then remains motionless for the remainder of the film. Refer to photograph F. Approximately 20 minutes later, the tape flashes to a single frame intertitle with the words, "I see you," colored in red. Refer to photograph G. The intertitle holds for 7 seconds, then immediately cuts to static. There is no further signal for the remainder of the tape. End transcript. This is the last known sighting of SCP-1981-1. SCP-1981-1 has been absent in all subsequent playbacks. If observed, staff are advised not to attempt to communicate with SCP-1981-1 and to alert any Level 4 supervisors on duty. This concludes the informational recording of SCP-1981.
Oh, how wonderfully enlightening! I hope you all have learned something new as well. But unfortunately, it appears that our time together is coming to an end. As much as that saddens me. But there is one last tale to be told before we leave you to your own devices tonight. This story is about a person I aspire to be, with the added element of my favorite creatures in the world, dogs. So please, sit back and enjoy none other than myself read to you Sugar. I waited in my old charcoal-colored van until he got home. I never smoked cigarettes, but during these times I always wanted to. It felt like the right thing to do when you're waiting, watching, and feeling awfully wrathful. It was around midnight, and the street was so poorly lit that I blended in with the asphalt almost seamlessly. I fidgeted around in the itchy fabric of the driver's seat. My right leg was slowly and mindlessly tapping up and down. I used to tap my right leg up and down faster than a hummingbird's heartbeat when I was nervous. But after a while, I've taught myself to calm down and save my energy for what's to come. Time and many cars passed by me. I had been parked down the street for a couple of hours at this point. Waiting truly was one of the hardest parts. I was always impatient to get the job done and return home to my dogs. Who knew when Tony would get home? I didn't know him that long. I didn't stalk him out to see what his schedule was like. Situations like this are time-sensitive for me. Finally, I saw Tony get dropped off at his one-story house. My stomach got punched with adrenaline. My heart was feeling like a mix between excited and needing lower levels of cholesterol. I watched him stumble into his unassuming little house, and I prepared myself. Tony had neighbors only 20 feet or so next to him. I hated causing commotion, and I certainly did not want to alert anyone of my presence. So I had to be careful. I dreaded proximities like this the most because I absolutely could not get caught. Technically, unfortunately, what I was doing was illegal. Morally? Well, I'm not sure what other people would think. I grabbed my purse and quietly exited my minivan. It wasn't a sexy car, but it was pragmatic. I looked inside my purse one more time to ensure I had the correct gloves, bags, rope, etc. I am careful, almost neurotically so, about what I wear and the tools I bring to these little salvations? I guess you could call it that. I walked to Tony's property and I peered into the window to try and locate where he was in the house. I saw he was passed out on the couch. It looked like there was some sort of drugs on his coffee table and an old Subway sandwich. Desperately, I wanted to go into the backyard and enter through his back door, but I knew his poor dog was kept behind the house and I didn't want to wake her up. So, I had to enter through this stupid basement window. As disturbing as these nights are for me, as tough as I think I am sometimes, I always get scared of dark basements. I unhinged the window glacially slow as to not make any noise, and I quietly slipped in. It's good to be limber, but I'm thinking of signing up for ballroom dancing lessons. I need to be lighter on my feet. I crept upstairs and watched Tony through the crack in the door. He snored. I hated him so much for what he did. I walked up behind him and simultaneously covered his mouth to muffle his screams, and injected him with a powerful tranquilizer I got at work. Did I mention I was a veterinarian? I run my own medical center. It's really fulfilling work. Animals can be such loyal, fantastic companions. Anyway, Tony would be out for maybe 2 hours if I was lucky, so I had to move fairly fast. I bound him together with rope and put a gag in his mouth. I blindfolded him, put earplugs in, and then put a bag over his head. I quickly yet nonchalantly pulled the minivan up to his house and opened the garage. My armpits were getting pretty sweaty as I assumed I was drawing some attention to myself. God, I hated tight-knit neighborhoods. I opened the trunk to my van and went back inside the house. I dragged all 200 pounds of Tony, which was hard to do, mind you, all the way to the car and hoisted him up into the cargo space. I shut the door and hurried to the backyard. I slowly walked up to Tony's dog and offered treats. I tried to be submissive and gentle. For once, someone was not here to hurt her. She cautiously came to me for a treat, and I strained to read her name tag. Sugar, it said. Sugar, I whispered to her. She cocked her head at me, listening. Most of these dogs never had name tags, let alone names. Good girl, I assured her. I wonder if she had ever heard that before. I looked over Sugar while I draped a comfortable leash around her neck and guided her to the car. Her left ear was gone, and it looked like it was either cut off, bitten off, or rotted off. Her skin was crawling in sores and a severe case of mange. The pads on her paws were bleeding and swollen, her neck raw from the choke collar Tony put on her. Among her emaciated and injured body were 2 glittering eyes looking up at me. I began to cry a little as she warily trusted me to take her to a better place. Judging by Sugar's split nails and the carvings in the cement, she had been trying to claw her way to a better place for a long, long time now. I scurried to the minivan with Sugar and opened the back door. A big, warm kennel was there for her to jump into. I had a little water inside her kennel for her to drink on the car ride home. Tony was still unconscious in the cargo area. As I drove home, I sighed. This was taxing work. I reflected on everyone who was waiting for me when I got back to my house. And I contemplated the best way to go about what I had to do with Tony. Finally, after what always feels like the longest drive of my life, I arrived home. I love living in the middle of nowhere. It's quiet and still. It's very relaxing and, quite honestly, a great environment for a recovering dog and a rotting human. I first softly bring Sugar's kennel out of the car and into my closed-off den. It's absolutely crucial that I keep my current dogs away from a new rescue as to not overwhelm her. I leave Sugar in a crate for just a moment as I get Tony out of the car and drag him to his new cage. As I drag him towards his 10x4 run, I pass all the other idiots who will never be up for adoption. The first crate I pass belongs to a terrible man who used to be called Big Joe. He ran a dogfighting ring in a tiny abandoned warehouse a couple towns over, betting a dog's life for money and drugs. I wasn't sure how many dogs had died because of him, but I was told it could have easily been hundreds. When I got to him, there were only 3 dogs in his possession. The first I found was a frightened puppy with broken legs, teeth, and an incorrectly docked tail. This puppy's tail was cut off crudely and had bone continuing to grow through the scar tissue. A pregnant, severely malnourished female dog covered in bruises and lacerations. And lastly, an aggressive male dog with an eye missing and burn scars all along its body. I later came to realize that Big Joe put out his cigars on this dog. So what happened to Big Joe? Well, to start, I broke both of his legs in multiple places, using a hammer and kettlebell weights. I removed his teeth using pliers and cracked some using nail clippers. I let Big Joe starve, feeding him the bare minimum when necessary. I removed one of his eyes with a melon baller, and to cauterize any bleeding tissue on his body, I simply used a lit cigar. And lastly, whenever I'm feeling especially mad at Big Joe, I let him and Lewis fight it out for food. Lewis was another cruel man who ran a dogfighting ring. He doesn't talk much. He wears a muzzle. The same muzzle that he made his dog wear. The same muzzle that had sharp spikes on the inside of it. I was shocked that such an item even existed. I modified it, though, to fit Lewis's face and mouth. As the day passed, I could see the prongs digging deeper and deeper into his flesh when he tried to talk back. Leanne was a few cages down. She was a trashy backyard breeder who used to chain her dogs by the neck out in the sun in the middle of her yard, which had broken beer bottles and drug needles strewn about. The morning I got her, I had watched her kick her dog for coming too close to her and laugh. That dog is now named Marty. Marty was treated and rehabilitated. He currently lives with a foster mom, pending adoption. Leanne, however, is chained by her neck, out in the middle of her short run. Whenever I have any glass to recycle, I make sure to do so by smashing it and covering the floor of her pen. I like to laugh when she crawls to me for food, cutting her legs and hands along the way. I like to remind her that animal abuse isn't funny. And so on and so forth. I have about 15 crates full right now. 16, actually, if you count the newest edition, Tony. Soon to be less, though, as a few of these assholes are close to dying. It's about 10 a.m. now as I write this. I've been up all night. Took me a while to work on Tony. He really put up a fight at first, but once I began slicing off his ear, he started to pass out from the pain. And that made things a lot easier. I poured some acid on his ear and let it do the rest of the job. I wanted to wrap things up with him quickly and get back to Sugar. I slipped a choke collar around Tony's neck and pulled it tight against his throat. I got my sander and put a nice, hearty grit on it and made sure to sand down the soles of his feet and palms of his hands until they were raw. I left him withering in pain. I left him just like he left Sugar. I then went back inside to take care of the sweet girl. When I entered the room, she was napping inside her kennel. I welcomed her into the den and watched her realize that she could walk forward more than 10 feet. She was very, very scared. But I knew she was slowly realizing that she was free. I gave her food, a bath, and began to treat her mange. She's resting now, actually, napping in front of the fireplace. I see a bright recovery and a loving future for Sugar. Tony? Oh, Tony. Not so much. And with that, our Halloween special has come to an end. I hope you all have enjoyed yourself tonight. I know I did. But before you go, please take a moment to go see all our wonderful narrators' channels tonight. I'm sure they'll more than appreciate it. And if you like what you heard, please feel free to subscribe to my channel, as well as everyone else's. I'd greatly, greatly appreciate the support. Now, with all that finally being said and done, I am PrincessAmiAudio, and I hope you all have a wonderful, frightening, spectacular, happy Halloween.